It was the South Bronx, violence just erupting almost anywhere, at any moment. Constant disturbance in the central nervous system just felt so overwhelming all the time. Everything was a test to demonstrate yourself, trying to always move with some thick sense of boundary. A lot of paranoia, a lot of self-doubt, a lot of fear. Even though on the outside, I wanted to be a tough guy, I wanted to be a street guy. The music's loud, the lights are blaring, everybody's smiling. And it just felt like I was in this intoxicating evil circus. Something was starting to accrue like a kind of cavity inside. Everything was like coming undone in a very painful and again scary way. And I kept feeling like I was tipping back into that really radical impermanence that you can't conceptualize. There was this unconditional love that just like erupted. And even people that I wanted to get some revenge against, I bumped into one of them on the street. I just remember the look of horror in their face. I just went up to them. I was like, I love you. It's okay. I gave them a hug. Their body was still kind of stiff, and I felt their bodies start to soften in my body, and I could feel their heartbeat like on my chest. And I was just like, I'm serious. Like, it's okay. Like, you see me anywhere, it's love.
All right, today I have a guest and a friend to come and chat with us about his history, his story, which is quite a trip, quite a journey, as it always is when we talk about this subject, this awakening subject. But he has one that's very unique and it's just fascinating, really. And he's just a heck of a nice guy, and he has a lot of insight to share, and in an honest and vulnerable way. Which every time I communicate with him, that's how he comes across, and he's just a great guy. His name is G. John, and I just want to introduce him and say hi. Hey, man, thanks for coming.
I appreciate you, Angelo. Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. Yeah. So let's just rewind the clock and start wherever it feels relevant for you, wherever in your life it feels relevant to start talking about how things played out when you were younger, maybe what sort of got you on the exploration of why do we suffer, and what is this all about, and that sort of thing. But wherever it feels relevant for you to start.
Absolutely. It's funny when you kind of say it that way, it's the first thing that kind of came up to my mind was like a dream as a little kid. I remember in New York City's public housing in the projects, they have parks kind of sporadically spread throughout the buildings. And this one park in particular, I have this image of, and it's got to be a dream. It's probably like my earliest memory of my mother leaving me in the park. And I was so young that when I woke up from the dream, I could see the bars of the crib. And there was something so unsettling about that experience, something so fundamentally upsetting that for whatever reason, it's left an aroma up until this moment. Like when you pause, no one's last time I thought about that. But right when you said that question, that's what came up. And I feel like one of the core kind of places of suffering for, this, however you want to say it, this kind of karmic layout or this body mind or whatever, has always been this kind of place of fear and loneliness, something like that. And I remember specifically when I was 7 or 8, leaving my cousin's house, and something about the consistency or the substantiality of things just like falling away, and being utterly kind of distraught, emotionally crying. I couldn't even explain it to my parents. They were looking at me like, what? I'm like, I remember I kept saying over and over, right? I was like, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the same. Saying that over and over. And they were looking at me, they're like, yeah, of course. I'm like, no, you don't get it. Like, we can come back tomorrow, but it's going to be different. Like, we can, just, that's all, that's what I kept saying. And it was like out of panic, was what the feeling was. And in a lot of ways, I feel like those kind of experiences kind of set me up into trying to kind of close that impossible thing to close.
Man, I'll tell you that that sense of impermanence that comes through when you tell that story. I can tell you that I've met many people on this path, or who've had these kinds of identity shifts and so forth. who've had situations or experiences like that, and I myself did as well. And I know the unsettling nature of it. And what's funny is sometimes it can be the opposite. Sometimes it can be like a mystical experience that feels expansive and heart open, but other times it feels very much like this isn't real. There's something not substantial about what we take to be the real world, and there's like almost the empty aspect that strikes you. But as a child, saying that to the parents too, fascinating. I mean, obviously you had an insight into impermanence at a very young age. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was like I don't know what to compare it to. Just being like utterly suspended and not being able to find the floor beneath you. Um, but it's funny because as time went on, things shifted. It's like I felt like looking back now is as if I was like actively trying to kind of like tie that loose end. Again, that thing that can't be tied. Um, and particularly in terms of boundaries, in terms uh, of trying to kind of substantiate myself as an individual and building a fortress of self that felt invulnerable.
Mm.
Um, and that was like a long, hard path. Like that was probably my first quote unquote practice in this life was creating like a dense self, something that just could float over or somehow numb itself to that. Um,
You know, that specifically is so interesting because I know everybody does that in one way or another, but I think many people, at least at the conscious level, would say they're doing it to defend themselves against some sort of trauma when they were younger, or a feeling of vulnerability, or a feeling of being victimized, or a feeling of not feeling secure. And I think all that is true in the relative, but I think you had a very pure version of it, because underneath all of that, there's something else we're actually running from. It truly, there's some other reason we're solidifying, and it's not a primary reason, but it's our interpretation of what actually happened, and it feels very compelling to try to solidify against that. Even people who have, there's sometimes through spiritual means, have tastes of the infinite, or tastes of the sort of unbound experience. If it's kind of in the extreme, they often will have that response for a while too, where it's like, no, I'm not sure I want to go in that direction. Let me go in this other direction. Let me be more human. Let me be more solid for a while.
yeah,
Yeah. So anyway, how did it start to play out as you were growing up, or how did you solidify? What was that like for you?
it could never really solidify in any fundamental sense again. Truly, it would find me at night. It would find me in moments when I was surrounded by people. Um, but like you said, like there was this like very fundamental way of trying to solidify a self. And over time, it became more and more kind of on the surface or superficial, if you will, because you could create that. There was still that capacity to ride and create that momentum, so to speak. I wouldn't exactly use those words now, but in terms of trying to like embody what that was like, I could say something like that. It felt like I could do make me, and make me a certain way, especially how I hold my face, how I speak, how I hold the space around others, things of that nature. And so it started like I wanted to be a tough guy. I wanted to be a street guy. So that's really how that started to take form. And really going outside, hanging out with the older guys and kind of learning how they made a name for themselves or how they um, made themselves appear invulnerable.
Yeah.
Um,
What part of what you mentioned New York? Was it like South Bronx, or which area did you grow up in?
yeah, so it was the South Bronx, and it was half my time was in the South Bronx, half was in the East Bronx.
Hmm. Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit? I mean, there are many people who don't know that world growing up in those environments, around those places, around those
yeah.
people. Um, some people do, of course, that'll be watching this, but can you give us a sense of, like you said, when you're a young man, like I remember being a young man or an older kid, and you're sort of wired to look for models of behavior. That's just how we're wired. We look to older older members of our species and go, that makes sense. That's how you become an older version of what I am right now. And you start to mimic behaviors and stuff. And what did you see? And just to give us a sense, what is it like to grow up in that environment?
Yeah. So it's funny because growing up in that environment, I feel like you see humanity in almost an archetypal sense. You see everything from, maybe it's not the proper word now, but we used to call them junkies. You'd see everything from junkies to guys wearing gold chains, nice cars. Your apartment building is, you go down the hallway, the doors are messed up, there's graffiti everywhere, the paint's peeling off the wall, piss in the elevator. You go outside in the park, and everything was like a test to demonstrate yourself. Just to play basketball on the basketball court, you already have to be proficient to be allowed on. Especially coming up as a young kid, you get beat up by the teenagers, kicked out of the park, you know, violence just erupting almost anywhere at any moment. That was very usual. Getting chased up and down the staircase by homeless people, it's like it was it was incessant. That's what I feel like. It was incessant. Like the sound, there's almost like this auditory, because the trains in the Bronx are above ground most of the time, and just that kind of incessant, just that cacophony of noise, and just like constant disturbance in my experience in the central nervous system just felt so overwhelming all the time. But I didn't recognize it then, I should say.
Yeah.
Only when I go back, sometimes I'm like, holy, like I was a piece of this, like, or this was a piece of me, or however you want to flip it. Like it was just, uh, yeah, just like incessant cacophony is what it felt like, and trying to always move with some thick sense of boundary. Always being curious as to who's this guy coming over here? Who's this lady? What do they want from me? Do they even want anything? You're always playing out these scenarios. There's always this like mapping of reality. Like if you can imagine like 100 frames just blowing up in a second, something along those lines.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, well, first of all, man, your heart goes out to any kid who grows up in an environment like that, because you're learning like self-defense on a continuous, constant basis in a very unpredictable environment, and a very unsafe environment a lot of the time, I'm sure. And the way you describe it, man, is so visceral. And I can imagine like you're just learning anything you can to keep yourself as safe as possible, and as vigilant as possible, right? And the vigilance is palpable when I hear this story. Did you like kind of form a group of friends who had similar ways of coping as you did, that is like your sort of tribe that keeps you safe and that sort of thing?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it was the kids that no one essentially wanted to mess with. It was we would bond in Saturday detentions, in school, suspensions, skipping school. That was just every day for us.
Wow.
And I think we all had some kind of fundamental sense of just how fucked up the whole thing felt,
I'm sure.
to a degree. And I feel like that's where we really found each other. I love those guys to this day. But that's really where we found each other, was in that space. And, from the outside looking in, we were a bunch of knuckleheads, we were getting arrested left and right. And, um, it's funny to look back on it now because it feels like a story, but those times were really filled with a lot of paranoia, a lot of um, self-doubt, a lot of fear.
Hmm.
Even though on the outside, it was like I was curating this kind of, you know, tough guy persona, I guess. I have
Yeah.
no idea. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but in that survival mode, um, it's not just an implicit teaching that you pick up, I'm sure, but it's very explicit that
Yeah.
you being emotional is weak, feeling is weak. It's not about that. It's about survival. It's about persona, and it's about projecting something that just says, do not mess with me at all. I'm not the guy you want to mess with. And when you build that persona, it requires constant effort, it requires vigilance, but it also sort of requires you to separate from a part of yourself. I'm sure you have unraveled that, later on. But
Oh,
I
yeah.
can't even imagine how that went. We'll talk about it, I'm sure. Yeah. So let us know, like fast forward, like how did that play out for you? How did you sort of find yourself coming into young adulthood, and
Yeah.
how did that look for you?
So at the end of high school, I had no ambitions of going to school or doing anything with like some long-term plan or goal. It was more just how can I make some quick money, enjoy the weekend, go out during the weeknights, and try and figure it out. I'd skip out of my parents' crib like 2 weeks at a time sometimes and just sleep over friends' houses and whatever, skip school completely, getting drunk, making money together. Um, and I just remember having uh, this kind of constant experience where it was like, okay, like it's Tuesday night, we just made pretty good amount of cash, call the girls over, get whatever we want over, have a good time. And even at the age of 16, something was starting to accrue like a kind of cavity inside, like this aching cavity. I don't know how else to explain it. Um, and it just felt like I was in this like intoxicating evil circus. I don't know how else, or carnival. I don't know how else to explain it. Like
Wow.
everybody's smiling, the music's loud, the lights are blaring, sex, what I thought I wanted, sex, clothes, money, whatever I wanted at that time was available to me and I could get it. And it
Probably
felt
a
like,
heck of a lot of validation and
oh
respect as
yeah,
well in that world.
absolutely. Absolutely. Um, and of course, like it was funny because in thinking about myself and mirroring some sort of inner self, those compliments, that validation felt like gold. But when it would actually happen in real time, it was the most flimsy, hollow, nothing, just like any other of those experiences that I was just chasing head on, like losing my balance forward, like my head pulling me. Uh, so, and that, again, that kind of cavity feeling of essentially that like eating junk food all day, that just kind of junk life, that junk self. Um, it just kept getting kind of more, I couldn't ignore it as much as I could. And over time, it was like eviscerating everything around me.
Mm.
Any ties I felt to even my friends or myself or my family, like everything was like coming undone in a very painful and again scary way. And I kept feeling like I was tipping back into that space of that just like really radical impermanence, that impermanence that you can't conceptualize.
Mm.
Like people think they're watching kind of a sunset, right? And there's something beautiful about that. But what I tend to see most people experience is they're imagining really the sunset. There's like these cues that they're starting to put together, and it's lovely and it's romantic. But really, when it comes out from under you, it comes out, and there's no way to really. And I should also caveat, sorry, just that sunset is more precious than the former sunset. Whatever it is that we were calling sunset before. But yeah, the initial kind of pulling and the grappling and trying to grapple with it is is so intense. I can't even explain it.
Wow.
But I'm sorry.
That's a trip. No, I mean that's amazing. Like the the contrast, this is your life, right? So it may not stand out quite as much to you, but like the contrast between like in one sense the gangster life, like the
Yeah,
just the flashy money, women, like all of that, and constant, and I'm sure the excess of it contrasted with this sense of like true impermanence, um that you were clearly in touch with the whole time. That's really fascinating. You think one of the reasons I love doing these interviews is because what I say all the time, anyone can wake up. Anyone can wake up. And I've talked to people who woke up in prison. I talked to people who woke up after prison. I've talked to people who've been in all kinds of lifestyles. And it doesn't exclude anybody. There are people out there in very intense lives right now, and gang lives and crime lives and all of it. They're waking up. I know it. I know they're there. They may not know what it is, but they know it, right? Um,
absolutely.
it really, really fascinates me. And it really heartens me, that even, and it really makes me feel like everyone's responsible for their actions in the relative sense. We have to we have to be held accountable and all that. At the same time, man, kids who grew up in environments like that, you're just learning to survive. You can only
Absolutely.
do what you see. How can you can't see outside of that world, and you become the world. And I understand it. I really do. I get it. And of course, even in the most difficult environments, people have direct access to their true nature. Of course they do. That's the beauty of this.
Absolutely.
So I didn't want to interrupt, but I just wanted to like highlight the power of what you just said, man. That's incredible.
No, absolutely. And I guess I should also provide the initial caveat too. I was not trying to awaken. There was no kind of sense that that was a possibility or anything. If somebody would have tried to communicate that to me at that time, like there's a way of experiencing or something like that that is free of everything that you know or whatever, or using words like bliss or whatever, I just probably yoke them up and be like what the fuck are you talking about? Like if like I'm gonna choke you and you tell me if you're free, like I would put you to a physical test. Um, so
I love it. I love it.
but that's really the vibe I was on at the time. And so this was not like part of like an explicit trajectory, right? That's really what I'm trying to say. Um, and I guess it kind of points to that this thing is so much bigger than whatever you can take this life, yourself, or the world to be. It just moves in a way that you can't grab. Uh, and so I should just fast forward a little bit. So I was about 18 at the time, and really, like every morning, I didn't wasn't working, wasn't going to school or anything, but I was making my money with my friends, and every night was a party. Every night was a party, and it became more nightmarish. Even like direct experience of just moment to moment, it just felt like I was being dragged across concrete. Um, and I remember waking up every morning, seeing the sunlight come in through the window, and I was like, man, like this ain't about shit. Like none of this is about shit. Like what's going on? None of this is about nothing. Like I don't. It just I don't know. It just felt everything felt so hollow. Um, and I think I shared this story with you before. And I remember going to see my mother one time. I hadn't seen them in months, and I grew up very close with my family. And I walk in through the door, and she just looks at me, and she goes, she's like, Johnny. I'm like, what? She's like, what's wrong? I didn't even know anything was up with me. I didn't feel anything. I was so divorced from that subterranean layer of self that I just didn't even know what happened. It was as if she just like cracked open a valve and I just started crying, sobbing, like as if all the years that I had held it in, just like it all was coming out. And I was so embarrassed that I just took off and I just left. I didn't see them for another month. Like I was so embarrassed by that. I remember driving away and just looking at myself in the mirror, like, what's wrong with you? What's going on? This is like it just totally judging, criticizing, trying to, build something back up again. Um, and now it stands out to me and it's so hilarious and so precious, that memory. But in that moment, like I was scared shitless. I was like, what was that? Where
Mm.
did that come from? I didn't even see it coming. I didn't know anything was like simmering or whatever. um and so anyways, my parents call me and they tell me that my grandma bought me a ticket to go to Albania with them. That's where my family's originally from. They were Albanian refugees. They came, and so I had never been outside of the East Coast and Detroit, where my mom's family immigrated to. So I was like, and mind you, it was that time where nothing was about shit. And I remember my mom calling me. I wasn't even excited to go to another country. I was just like, maybe it'll be something else. Hopefully it will be something, right? And we went there, and the first week was the worst experience of my life. It was like being put in session and not knowing you were going into session. The My father's village was a 2 hours hike up a mountain, and like sheer like mountains, like what you have in Colorado. And the whole village was out there, and the smell of livestock, the smell of like my first, second, third cousins, this whole lineage of people there, like waiting to greet me, like tears in their eyes, and the rot in their mouth, and just the smelly mountain people body, and I'm greeting everybody, and I'm like, and all of them are kissing me, pinching me, hugging me, and my initial thought is, you don't even know me.
Mm.
Like, why are you hugging me, pinching me? Like, you don't even know me. Like, it was like all that vitriol of this constructing of me was like being spewed, like everywhere in all my interactions. And it's like this unconditional love that I was met with, this kind of like tribal love. It was just like I was just trying to like melt it, just like pierce through it, like make it as flimsy as everything else. And again, that week was horrible. There was no partying, there was no way to kind of even get lost in any sort of stimulus. The flies are always on you, there's the smell of livestock. You're just like on the mountainside watching the clouds over the mountains. Um, and then there was just this complete and utter turning inside out or outside in. I don't know how to say it. And I don't even remember the time. Like, I don't even know how long it was, but I just remember it was just like something had just kind of like 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 old skin just like flaked off or something. I remember looking at my hand and just kind of putting it up and looking at everything else. And there was no, like, the tacit understanding or perception before of that, like there's a thingness to every single kind of object, and there's something substantial there. It completely turned into the tacit understanding that there's absolutely nothing there. There's absolutely nothing. Um, and there's nothing that makes like this different than like anything else in a sense. And I couldn't say those words then, but it
Yeah.
was just the feeling was like, and I, in equal measure, there was this kind of, and that's just a phrase. That's not, it's not, I don't mean that literally, but there was this unconditional love that just like erupted from, it was just everything. It was
Mm.
literally everything was what it felt like.
Mm.
I remember even seeing my parents far off near my grandpa's brother's house, like a little bit higher in the mountain. And I loved them like a baby. I don't know how else to say it. And like everything that I felt like they did to me, or like all the like fucked up shit that I felt like I had to go through with not only them, but, people in my life that I even held vendettas against and I wanted to get revenge against when I got back home, it all just completely dropped. And it was like, of course you did that. You're trying your best in some sense. Like, it's
Mm.
what it's what was passed on to you. Like, it's not your fault, essentially. It's not, it's not anyone's fault. Like, this catastrophe that has been so painful in so many ways, it's not anyone's fault. And at the same time, there's something utterly, utterly beautiful, like wonderful about it. Um, and there was nowhere to put the blame anyways at that
Mm.
point. It was just like sweeping everything.
Yeah.
um yeah.
What I sense, I just want to point out something. What I sense, that I really just want to highlight for anyone watching, for you, this is obvious and visceral, but if I would make a comparison, the difference between what you experienced as a small child, that impermanence and the sort of fear that came with it, and the nothingness, the insubstantiality, um, the contrast of that and what you're talking about now, to me, is very obvious. And tell me if I'm wrong. The insubstantiality is there, but there's the other part of it is there now. The other part of it is the interconnectedness, we could say, or I use the term intimacy because I just don't have a better term for it. But it's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
intimacy. It's undeniably intimate. It's undeniable that, yeah, there is no thing here, but because there's no thing, the appearance of this is literally everythingness vibrating. It's as close as you could ever get. It's not even close. It's everything. It's um Dogen would call it, total exertion. It's the whole universe exerting itself as this sound, as this sensation. And when you have access, in a sense, to both sides, through ego attrition, through a shift in identity, it's exactly what you're talking about. And it's also just that. It's just so. It's not an experience. Yeah.
right, right. Yeah, there's nowhere to like even me kind of recalling the story. Like I know that that's not a place or a thing. It's nowhere to like land. And uh, for anyone hearing this that is trying to imagine it, that's not it. It's just not. It's not something that I'll ever like whatever it is that I just recalled it as. That's not even what it was, really. I know this sounds crazy, but that's exactly it. Um,
Yeah.
but
How would you guide somebody who is watching this and hears you say whatever you're imagining, it can't be that. It's not that by definition, which is absolutely true. And yet, if they get a flavor of what you're talking about, what would you tell them? How would you tell them to maybe investigate that?
I think I would orient them towards the flavor. Like, okay, like, I would probably say something do you feel me? Do you like hear that there's like something here? And it's not the image. It's not anything that you can start to envisage. It's not any machination of the mind. But I would just call them a little closer. Like, do you feel me right now? Do you hear me right now? And not yes. The answer is not yes. The
Mm,
answer is not no. Do you hear me right now? That's it.
it's beautiful. Perfect. Man, tell me a little more about that trip.
Yeah. So it's so funny is that trip was uh I loved the trip so much. I mean, it was so funny because it was in another sense, I got to connect with this part of uh my family's conditioning that didn't really fit New York City, but it fit those mountains, because in the city again, like everything was about boundaries and like testing people's boundaries and making sure yours are not tested. Whereas there was this kind of overflowing of bodily connection, which felt so right to me, even though I wouldn't have admitted it during the first week. Like, for example, I grew up sleeping in the same bed with my grandparents and siblings and cousins. So, like, we were always like puppies on top of each other in a certain sense. But then you go outside and then it's like, okay, put the armor on. Uh, but over there, it was just like everywhere. Like everyone's always talking to you, touching you, it's like everything is like right here. But that was comfortable. It,
Mm,
it felt so comfortable. It felt so right. It felt so connected. And after that kind of like pivot, it's how I naturally wanted to express. And I wasn't second guessing anything I was doing, which was something I was doing all the time and I didn't realize it. It's like always hesitating, always kind of trying to evaluate. And there was just this way of moving that was just utterly free, loving, loving not in any sort of directional sense. It's just like loving. Um, and it was so palpable and it felt so like ingrained in the kind of culture that was there, like the lifestyle that was there. Which that sense of impermanence is harder to hide from over there. Uh, but uh but yeah, that was mostly the rest of my trip was just hanging
mm,
out in the mountains and just being just endlessly just like the vividness of each moment, the lack of any sort of hesitation about time or plans or any of that stuff. It was like I guess you could call it an actual vacation in a sense. Is what it felt like.
mm,
uh, yeah, and then first day we got up to the village. This guy that was kind of cooperating with the communists at the time, like years ago when communism was still in place. He's kind of like the scapegoat of the village. And I remember I was saying hello to everyone, and he was kind of far off uh, in the distance. And my dad kind of looks at me, and I got to say something about my dad real quick. Very insightful person as well. Like him and I have grown so much together since that day. But anyways, he goes, we have to say hello to him, which it would be more proper for us to ignore him because, all the kind of he's like stained essentially in a sense, right? And everybody else is, upright and, not cowards. But if anyone was in his position, they probably would have done the same. Uh, So we go over to him, and he sees my father, and he's like, "This is your son?" He's like, and they're speaking in Albanian, of course. He's like, "Yeah, this is my son." And he grabs me and he starts crying, and he says, "Your blood has washed these mountains," is what he says. Like all the wars that have been there and just the generations of kind of trauma on those mountains and defending those lands and all this stuff. He says that, and but it wasn't like a tough guy thing he was saying. Like there was such a suppleness in his tears, in his eyes. He was, by the way, he was 94 years old working the fields. So let's just also put that in perspective. And I still remember it, like that feeling of the way he looked at me was so penetrating and just so like free of any kind of judgment or anything like that. I just remember how that like touched me in some way. And of course, like I felt myself just like I am now, almost on the verge of tears. I felt myself even in that moment, like really about to start like opening up in that way. And I just had to turn, I just like turned and kind of like navigated it in whatever. I don't even really remember how I did it, but I just remember like this like feeling even inside of just like I have to move, like I have to get out of this somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that was the first day. And then the last day, as we were leaving, my grandpa's brother, he calls me as we're about to go over the precipice and back on the trail down the mountain. Goes, "Oh, John!" And he just lets off two shotgun shots. Bang! Bang! And I was like, I'm home. you know? That was mostly the trip. There's not so much to talk about in terms of
So
details because
beautiful.
it was really the same thing every day, just like being on
Mm.
this mountainside and
You said a hell of a lot, man. That was a powerful sharing. Again, like I always highlight this stuff for anyone watching, but the beauty of awakening, or this call that we make to our true nature, however we make it. Sometimes it's sort of involuntary, other times it's voluntary, but the answer is usually a disruption. The answer that often leads to awakening or results in awakening or whatever is often a disruption. It can happen in all kinds of ways. For me, it was like a breakup. It was like the one thing I thought I could make me happy in life was a romantic partner, and the breakup showed me that wasn't going to happen, and that was a massive disruption for me in that moment in my life. For you, like the contrast, like life is ingenious. The contrast between the life we're living in New York, getting on a plane and just landing there, the contrast, you couldn't make up a better contrast of environment, people, hygiene, nature, your access to nature, constantly in contact with everyone all the time, the communication styles. Like that's just a complete disruption in everything you know. And
oh
yet
yeah.
that's perfect. That's the perfect disruption. It won't feel good for the first week, right? It won't
Oh
feel good at
no.
first. It'll feel like this is everything you don't want. And all of a sudden, boom, like it sneaks up on you. And that's how this works. That's how, so anyone's going through this stuff, man. You're going through disruption in your life. Um, Open to it, man. Open, let go. It's here for you in a way you can't even imagine.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So then you came back, man. You landed back in the world you were more familiar with, and how'd that go?
So I guess in terms of just kind of the logistical stuff, everything that I was doing before, I just couldn't even muster the will to do it. I just told my friends, I was like, guys, listen, I'm done. I'm done. That's it. Um, and what's funny is some of them heard me. Like I remember seeing, and when I was expressing like why at the time, um, I remember like I felt like some of them were hearing me from that space, and others were repulsed from that space. Um, and it was very palpable because those that were kind of hearing me over within a year or so, they also stopped with those activities that we were taking part in before. Um, and they have shifted over time as well. Um, but then those that kind of were kind of repulsed by me even suggesting that I would be done or whatever that represented or whatever it looked like when I entered that room. I don't know what that was. Like it was just like, all right, like get the hell away then. Like it's over, it's done. So in one way, I'm really grateful that it was clean in that sense. Um, And even people that like I said, that I wanted to get some revenge against, I bumped into one of them on the street like a week after coming from Albania. I just remember the look of horror in their face. And I just went up to them. I was like, I love you. It's okay. Like, if you see me anywhere, you just know that it's okay. I'm not joking. Like, I gave them a hug. Their body was still kind of stiff, and I felt their bodies start to soften in my body, and I could feel their heartbeat like on my chest. And I was just like, I'm serious. Like, it's okay. Like, you see me anywhere, it's love. Like, don't ever misconstrue that. And I just kind of like left it like that and just kept it moving. Um,
That's
and
so beautiful, man. The reason I laughed is I'm thinking of it from their perspective, and they're going, it must have been going, oh my God, this is the worst way to for it to end. You know,
right,
this guy's telling me he loves me, like this is gonna be really bad.
right, right. There's gonna be somebody from behind that grabs their shoulder, throws them in a car.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But no, that was that.
That's
Um,
awesome.
and it was funny because I remember even kind of the receptivity from family members as well, particularly my father. Um, he was very religious. We grew up in like a very kind of old world kind of Catholic religious framework. Again, these are mountain people. It's like their religion, the way that they speak, everything is infused with this kind of talk of God and swearing upon the mountains and the stones. And, there's this kind of rich language and way of uh, speaking from that place of religiosity that people can construct. And I just remember talking with him about God because I had gotten really interested in like reading the Bible and other spiritual texts because something like made sense all of a sudden. I was like, well, what was that happened to me? Like, what was that thing? And so I was trying to get it, right? It was like a month or two later that like it felt like just like a new thing was coming online. It was just wider. Like the sense of self was just like now cellophaned on all of reality. It's like, oh, it's all one, or it's God, or it's the universe, or it's this. Just some sort of conclusion some ultimate conclusion that I can make, right? And so I was like trying to harness it because something felt like it was getting away. And it was really just like those machinations coming back online. Um, and so I was kind of scrambling, looking through texts, and it felt like I could understand it. And it's like, oh, it makes sense. So I would talk with my father about it and just ask him, like, what is God? Like, what is God? Like, not the man with the beard. Like, what is God? And I remember, like, it was the first, like, true moments that I felt like I really had with him, besides when I was really small, where he would look at me and just like, I could feel something just like opening up. I don't know how else to say it, but he would just say, I don't know. And it was like that I don't know was the realest thing I ever heard someone say in my life, period. And how it was said. It wasn't like, like, I don't know. It was like it was from his being or whatever. Like it was just it just emanated so clearly from him in that moment. And so we would connect in that way. And from then on, like he's been on his own little um, trajectory, very different from mine, of course, but beautiful as well. Um, but I should be utterly honest and like admit, like within a few months, things like you have the phrase of the other shoe dropping. I can't tell you, like it was as if I never even had that experience, or like there was nothing I could say or begin to orient. It was as if like I was just getting dragged to the bottom of the ocean and there was nothing I could do. Just that like black sea of sorrow, despair. Like at the time I was saying it was like as if all my worst feelings were amplified. How it appears to me now is just like there was nothing to cover them anymore, or to interpret them, or twist them, or just like kind of let a crack open a little bit for a moment. It was just the whole thing. And that lasted for months. It was
Mhm.
terrifying. It was horrible. Um, and that's what got me into Zen practice. So I was like trying because again I was like reading all these texts. I was like, okay, like it's saying a lot, but what do I do? Like every moment of my life, it just feels like I'm being like literally like crucified or something like that. Like it's just like painful, painful, and there's no way. to turn anymore. There was no way to kind of pivot or build any wall, or there was nothing. It's like it was everything. Just like in that moment, there was that utter sense of, maybe you could call it freedom or bliss or something like that. It was as if the equal had just happened to me in the opposite end.
Hmm.
Utter terror. I would wake up at night and it was like I would feel my body like vibrating, and I could audibly hear like drums or something. And to the point where I'm like looking outside, I'm like, is somebody playing drums? Like, what is this? Like, dum, 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 dum. And I'm like, what is this? And it would kind of go on its own eventually, and then find me another night, and it would kind of revisit. And so I was like, what do I do? There was no, there was no semblance of a map that I could even use. And I was looking for a map at that time.
Hmm.
Uh, and so that's how I came across Zen. I remember eventually somehow I read the Tao Te Ching, and I was like, this is like the closest thing that I feel like is saying it with, like, even the opening line is like, you can, the Tao you can say is not the Tao. And it's like, I'm like, he's on the money, but I'm not. So like, where, how do I get back to that? Like, I know this.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, and then eventually that led me to Zen, and it was on a Wikipedia page, and it said it was a Bodhidharma's quote, "A transmission beyond the scriptures." I
Hmm.
was like, yes, okay, but what? So what? What do I do?
Yeah, right.
Um,
Exactly. What do I do now? Speaking of Bodhidharma, when you mentioned the conversation with your father, and his answer was, when you said, "What is God?" You said, "I don't know." That's a
right,
different kind of I don't know. That's the I don't know. That's the Bodhidharma I don't know.
right,
And the emperor
absolutely,
said, who's standing before me? And he just said, "I don't know."
right. Are you a prince? Are you a Buddha? Are you a no? I don't know.
Yeah. So did you go find a center, Zen center, or how did you sort of approach Zen?
So I so the with so off the page I read that there's Zen masters.
Mhm.
So there's somebody who's got it, right? Like somebody who's stabilized it or something like that. And I was like, okay, like there's somebody I can like grab them and be like what happened to me? Like what is this? Like what are we talking about? Like how do I do this thing? Because it feels like I just want to die. I don't want to die, but I want to die. Like I just want to like something disappear somehow. And so I just typed in Zen Master into the Google search bar, and this place in upstate New York, Zen Mountain Monastery, popped up. And something about the image, I remember going on the home website, the screen, and something about the image of just seeing a line of people sitting zazen. It was so like riveting and attractive. I've never done something like that before, like meditation, seated meditation. There was something about that image that was like, it was like, I remember when I first saw like skateboarding, for example, I was like, I have to do that. Or like boxing, like I have to, like, it was like this physical draw. Um, and I didn't really look at anything else. Like I looked at the teachers, I was like, oh, I was like, okay, there's teachers or whatever, but like that's something. Like I don't know what that is, but that's something. And so I go there like on a random Sunday, and and like I remember the first time I sat, it was just like everything kind of, it was like when that I don't know, like just the, like that intense fear that would visit me at night, it immediately just like came on right when I sat. And I was like, I gotta get up, I gotta get out of here, I gotta get out. And I just remember thinking, like literally just that little like a former G-John came up, is like, you're gonna look like a bitch. Like, don't run. You're gonna look like a bitch. Like that was the only thing that kept me sitting there, was that little voice of like, dude, you're gonna look like so pathetic, so flimsy, so whatever. And I sat through it, and it was torture. And I remember going down to the, what they call the dining room. I remember looking at everyone smiling. I'm like, how are they smiling? Like how, what are they smiling about? I couldn't even begin to fathom what it was that they were smiling about. Like I was like, I just got out of like a torture chamber up there. Like what was that? Like, and everybody's like laughing. Um I couldn't even like bring myself to have a conversation with anyone. And thankfully everyone there is just so lovely and like socially accommodating that someone eventually talked to me. But what was so funny is like lifelong patterns of uh uh like when discomfort would arise and I try and avoid it just like in the most minuscule ways. Like I would go to the bathroom. Like I came downstairs, I was looking at everyone. I'm like, how are they smiling? I'd go to the bathroom, even though I didn't have to go in the stall, walk out, get a cup of water, even though I wasn't thirsty. Like just something to like try and orient or get away from that space. And it was like, it was so obvious in that space. But at the same time, there was also this kind of like dual recognition of like, for some reason, this feels like the most important thing I've ever learned
Mm.
was to kind of sit. Um, and yeah, and from there, like I ended up living there for 2 years and then going to Japan for about a year and a half, living in a Zen monastery and becoming a monk as well.
Mm. At some point, do you remember a shift in your experience of zazen, of the pain itself, or the discomfort, or the emotional discomfort?
Absolutely. Two really stand out to me. I remember when it felt like Zazen finally kind of revealed itself in a sense. It was there was the constant. It was during session actually, and I literally imagined like having a scythe in my hand, and every thought, every emotion, anything that it could start that would start to manifest, it was like the scythe was just cutting through it, and it was exhausting. After just 30 minutes of doing that, like I was toast. And I was so just down on myself. I'm like, I can't do this. Like I thought I was going to meditate here for a month and I was going to be the Buddha himself. Like what the hell, like this is not going anywhere at all. And then it was something I don't know how I remember it with a thought at first, like just feeling like a thought being born in a sense, like how nebulous it is and how in the way I was experiencing it then, it was like almost like aromatic in the body, some sense like that. I don't know how to explain it. Like it wasn't solidified and it wasn't really detailed or it was very low resolution in a sense. And I was like, oh, like this is literally as phenomenal. It was like as if any realization since the initial one has just been like a reiteration of the first one in some sense. I don't know how else to explain it, but it was like this thought, this emotion, however it's kind of moving through the body, is equally as phenomenal uh, and substantial as like the star in the sky. This is not like something to fear. And it
Mm.
wasn't like I was exactly saying that. It was just this feeling. It was this like intuition of just staying there and just allowing it to kind of steep. Like sitting was allowing all of this to just steep and settle and just blend in a way that was very clear. Um, and from that point on, but again, like from that experience, later when I would not be having that experience, I would try and reorient to that experience again. Um, and I think, yeah, so in a lot of ways, I felt like the way practice was being taught was actually putting a lot of hurdles in a sense, like in front of what I was doing. But it was really in Zazen where I found kind of where things were allowed to steep, I
Mhm.
guess you could say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's as I'm listening to this, reflecting back on the incredible expansiveness and intimacy of the awakening in Albania, and you characterized it so well, the stark contrast to the crash into the shadow material, where
Yeah,
you said as much as that felt awake and enlightened, this felt quite the opposite. It was so solid, but also your caricature of it, like not being able to turn away from anything anymore. Whereas before awakening, you can kind of turn away from everything because we disassociate. We develop personas. We're always, that's one thing that the mind identified person can do is endlessly distract themselves. And that's what it feels like with, especially with a big shift, is there's no distraction anymore. Like if there's emotion, you have to feel it. You have to feel it.
yeah,
And then and so that can be very distressing to people, especially after awakening, because the contrast is so stark. But I just want to point out that this does mature, especially if You're vulnerable, you're humble, you seek guidance from someone who's actually walked this path before you. You did all the right things actually, and then they come together, and they come together in the way you just described at some point, in Zazen for you, and it can happen in different ways. You actually find that the infinite expansive nature and the what we would call contracted when we're resisting it, but when there's not resistance between those two, they're actually not in, so they're not in contrast at all. That the intimacy and the expansiveness and the visceralness and the infinity, they're all really intertwined, and that's that sort of interpenetration. You could call it, like Tozan would maybe call it, the sort of absolute within the relative. It comes
Yeah.
full circle, and all of a sudden you it's like another level of maturity and spiritual practice. Not that you have a badge of honor, but the maturity feels like trust. It feels like trust in life and in practice itself and in the process itself. Yeah.
Right. So much so that the word practice it falls away. It's
Yes.
like what was I even saying before?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. One time I was talking to a Zen teacher, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, and she was talking about practice and practice and practice. And I said, but is there a practice, And she kind of just laughed. And I said, because if there's a practice, what's not practice? Right.
Right.
Like,
Right.
how do you divide reality into practice and not practice? How do you divide reality into spiritual and not spiritual, or, divine and mundane, or you can't anymore at some point. And the realization shows you that through you could call it the interface between the relative and absolute, between the seeming physical body with emotional experiences and thought experiences and consciousness, and that which is realized that is just really none of that, and shows that ever never existed. But those are not two. And now you're in that place where it's okay, both the relative and absolute. It's okay to express in any way that needs to be expressed, and it's also very spontaneous. Yeah.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
Angela, I got to give you, like, I don't know how much time we have left, but I got to just give some love, like, your way, because um, what led me out of living in a Zen monastic setting was the words I had for it at the time was like I felt like there was like this kind of emotional dodging coupled with like groupthink that would happen. So when my friends kind of put me onto you, they're like, "Yo, check this guy out and tell us what you think." I remember I was like, another YouTube guy talking about awakening or whatever. But I watched the video and I was like, "Oh, there's something here." And like put you really elucidate the shadow as a part of the path, which was never really explicitly pointed to. In a sense, in those moments where I felt like I swung back into the shadow, um, it was as if I felt like I was doing something wrong, or I didn't get something, or it was like it, I just remember having that like visceral like initial reaction of like, oh, I'm not doing the practice right. Like I have to practice harder. I got to do something else better, or like I'm giving into this or that. And that's not what it was about at all, like
Mm.
at all. So your videos on the shadow for me, it was like the last like little bit of just like where where um where it felt like not only encouraged, but it was obvious to me that being utterly open to that was the way. And it was like I was dipping my toe and doing it all along the way. But it was like just that last little thing is like, yeah, dude, like you're okay. Yeah, the waters are dark, and they're not dark at all. Like you, in a sense, it's like it's exactly the thing that really uh, informs the absolute, if you will,
Mm.
in terms of our capacity for understanding in relative terms the suffering of others. It's like, yeah, of course,
Mm.
this is an insane thing that we're going through. Like
Yeah.
this is
Yeah. Yeah.
that's one way of speaking about it. Like bringing it back into like concrete terms. It's like, yeah, like you don't know, and that's the biggest, scariest thing,
Mm.
worse than any boogeyman you can imagine, right?
Yeah.
But in an absolute sense, it is like the thing. It's the like when I saw your videos about the shadows, like these things that I felt like were wounds or like things to try and sew up and close, like those were the gateways actually. And I can't thank you enough for that.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah. My pleasure. Boy, you just reflecting on this, your whole life, in a sense, is an exploration of shadow. I mean, in a lot of ways, all of our lives are, but in a very gross way, in a very like outward way, in a very literal way, in the shadow of the street. Like that's where you started. That's the shadow you started to explore, and you realize very quickly that's not, it was survival, and that's what you needed to do at the time. And it's like, but you knew it was hollow, and then it's like the shadow of that was when you went back and saw a whole different side of reality and your family and your lineage and humanity, and dropped into a whole different reality, and then came back and explored the deep emotion shadow, and even the shadow that can hide in monastic spaces, all of it. Like that's what I feel from you. And what I want to say is, like, I've met you in person. For anyone watching, I've spent a week with you, and I met you in person, and the best way I can really get a gauge of somebody, not that I actually try to do this or judge people, because I don't, but I notice it for sure. I definitely notice, is being around somebody. It's the way they move, the way they interact with others, the way they are when they're not on camera. Like all of that tells me so much. And the thing that strikes me about your life, now that I've heard it all laid out this way, and also just knowing you and how you express right in this moment, what it reminds me of is what Adyashanti calls redemptive love. That's how it feels to me, because you move with a tremendous softness. But coming from somebody who literally came from, in a sense, the street, and had and still does have tremendous street smarts and all of it, and you probably have extremely good judgment, and you have very good situational awareness at all times, because you had to learn it, and you don't unlearn that. At the same time, you walk with true compassion, true love, softness, vulnerability, very obviously. To be able to merge those, to be able to wake up to where those aren't two in this lifetime, is amazing to me. And it's an example to anyone who lived a life like you did. It's like, hey, if you feel what we're talking about, man, this is accessible to you, no matter how hardened you've become, no matter how distanced from your emotions you become. It doesn't matter. Like, you have access to this, and you just really have to open to it and let life show you what it can show you, because it can show you some pretty astounding realities. So I just want to hand it to you for, you've done the work all along. Every breadcrumb you've picked up and followed, and I can tell just by talking to you. And I know what you've been through. I know what kind of shadow work you've been through. I know it. I can feel it. So thank you for, orienting to this in the way you do, because it's everything to you, and I can tell. It's pretty cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You have anything you would say to somebody who could just happen to see this video sometime between now and 100 years from now on YouTube, and they grew up in an environment like you did, or just they relate to that sort of street smart dude, or woman, who learned to build that persona and build those defense and coping mechanisms, and lives that kind of lifestyle? What would you say if they resonate with this?
Just say, like, baby, like, it's so familiar. Like, the thing that you feel like you're protecting yourself from is exactly the thing that you have to expose yourself to. However that feels or manifests. It might be a person, it might be an apology, it might be however it is that the mind is kind of cueing you in this moment. And the love, the connection, the most worthwhile thing is it's in a funny sense, it's the most familiar thing. And it's available to you in this moment right now, no matter what kind of mask is coming up, no matter what kind of horror appears to be out there. It's right here. And it's the most familiar thing, especially that love that you were pointing to just now, Angelo. To me, like, that kind of, it's like it was always there somehow. And I just don't know how I got so far away from it, in a sense, you know. But that's what I would just say. Just like, whatever feels like whatever it is that you're feeling, whatever is coming up, like, that's exactly what needs to come up. And so what I mean by that is, be open to that, however it comes. Express it however it wants to be expressed, maybe through words, maybe through frying your vocals with a yell, uh, perhaps rolling on the ground, tumbling a little bit, it's always so personal. I can't say what to do, but I just say, baby, it's all right. Like, it's so familiar, and it's right here.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I just thought to add something that came from your story too, that is like, look for a disruption that might be knocking on your door. It could be
Yeah.
anything. It could be an opportunity. Someone's inviting you to go visit them somewhere in the world that you've never been to, or who knows what it is, right? You don't know. Be like the last thing you want to do, maybe, but shit, maybe you could take a week off. Maybe you could take a month off. Maybe you need that, you know? Don't worry about disruptions. Disruptions can be your friend in the biggest way, you know, if you just open to the possibility of learning something that's beyond what you know, touching into something that's a deeper instinct than the usual day to day that life that you've just found yourself in, actually, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say to it then is just even for the one that will never watch or see this video.
Beautiful. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. People are going to get a ton out of this. I already know that. And yeah, just thanks a lot. Thanks for your honesty, your vulnerability, and what a sharing such a great story.
Angelo, you're the man. I love you, brother. Take care of yourself, and
Love you
I
too,
hope to
man.
see you sooner than later.
I'm sure we will. All right.